to our meeting tonight. We have Rob Robinson and his staff here to present their latest findings and to engage in a discussion with the community. Rob?
Jay, we may need to wait a few seconds. Rob has not joined us as of yet.
Yeah,
Ashley is here.
I am. Rob's having some trouble getting connected, so I am working that problem.
All right, well, we'll keep working on that, but we would like to welcome everybody from the community. We understand that there was a power outage, and thankfully, with all the heat, we understand the power is back on now. So very glad that all of you are able to join, and that we also have air conditioning or fans that are able to operate. Would like to say that if anybody is aware of anybody that is having difficulty, we do have a actual physical location that can be used as an alternate. And Austin, maybe you could share that location with the community just so they can inform their friends and family if need be.
Hi, everyone. Yes, our virtual viewing location is at St. Andrew's Episcopal Church here at 1002 South Main Street, corner of South Main and North Markley. If you would like to, or if you still know of anyone that's still having connection issues or power outage issues.
But according to the Duke map, it looks like the power is all back on, but we know how that works. Sometimes that's not true when you're sitting in the dark. So we just want to make sure everybody is aware that there is that connection. And we'll go quiet so you don't have to listen to us. But as soon as we get Rob on, we will get started. So thank you again.
Austin, I'm going to have him try to join as an attendee. So if you see him pop up, if you could promote him to panelist.
Yeah, I was going to suggest that if all else failed.
I just found him in the attendee list. He's already there, Austin. Again, we apologize for the technical difficulty.
There we go.
Rob,
Thanks.
I think you're in it. I'm going to move you to presenter.
Okay. Okay. So I can share my screen.
I think you should have it now.
Got it.
Very good.
Perfect.
Well, Rob, we already introduced your fine work, and so we will let you take us from here.
Great. Thank you so much, Jay. Sorry, everybody. It took me a little bit of time to get on. I'm still learning from Jay all the IT tricks for the city's website. So I'll get there. But thanks for making the time for us tonight. We've been working on the sort of advancing the ideas that we talked about in the plan on our last meeting and continuing to refine these. So this is a snapshot for us for the thinking about the elements of the plan and the strategy that we talked about from the beginning, which is this notion of really thinking about precincts within the West End that may have different kinds of requirements and context for different sorts of buildings, setbacks and adjacencies block by block, land use considerations, and infrastructure improvements. So I wanted to go through that a little bit tonight in more detail so that we could begin to have more specific conversation about some of the proposals that we anticipate blending into the draft. So This is very much a work in progress. We have through July here where we wanted to work on this small area plan and then begin to discuss with the Planning Commission some of the elements that are showing up in the plan, getting feedback again from the Planning Commission, of course, to begin to test some of these ideas. Also with the Design Review Board, who sees projects that come up in the West End. We also have a scheduled call with them to go over some of the ideas here and get their feedback and their thoughts about the toolkit as we move forward. So again, thanks for the input. A lot of what we're demonstrating tonight is a synthesis of starting to synthesize a lot of those comments that we've been getting back, and then thinking about how it works going forward within the process of the city's update for the land management ordinance and the tools that go along with that. So just a reminder here, the reason that we're embarking on a small area plan is to begin to start tying development patterns to a bit clearer future vision of the whole place. It's as things develop and change over time, how do we begin to connect these into a coherent pattern and relationships? So these elements here of enhancing connectivity and being able to identify common addresses and distinct areas within a broader geographic area is important to us. And then getting better as we go through here, because you can't always anticipate what the adjacencies are going to be. How do you balance the scale and the differences in a more fluid way so that it's coherent as a place? So we talked about these sort of three elements of this idea of the small area plan, and that the first one was, let's make sure that we're understanding the distinct areas within the West End and begin to calibrate to grow in a way that's sympathetic with the sort of general wisdom, if you will, and vision for neighborhoods within the West End. And then once we do that, instead of just going into zoning as the only category for this is really meant to inform how well current zoning is working. Is it jived with the vision over time? What changes need to occur? So this is really the sort of vision framework that we're suggesting that sets and informs future policy. So a regulating plan is really a way of saying we're going to break it down into smaller blocks and half blocks, if you will, to think about how buildings and setbacks and adjacencies and height might work within each of those blocks rather than spreading it like peanut butter everywhere. So you'll see a little bit of that here, introduce that here. Certainly you can't digest it in just a digital presentation like this, but this will be available for you to download off the website, the Social Pinpoint and the city's website, so you can review it and give us feedback as this progresses. So the regulating plan is a big tool that takes us from vision into thoughts about what that means to some of the more detailed criteria for how buildings fit on their sites and how they fit adjacent to existing buildings. The third part of that is really translating this into a little matrix of building types, sort of general building types. We have, and we'll talk about those a little bit. This is a catalog that's emerging now. We're putting this together as we go through this, but you're getting a little bit of a picture about how we intend to use that within the small area plan, so we can get a better sense of what might be happening in specific areas throughout the West End. So those three elements together tie up the logic for the small area plan and how to think about it. There are other components too, for sure. And you've identified some of those: infrastructure improvements, safety improvements, access improvements over time. And we talk about that within each of the precincts and the overall West End as an ancillary portion to this regulating plan and block typology plan. So in thinking about building types, I just want to pull this up a little bit so you can see how the matrix starts to work. You know, in many ways, residential buildings are a piece in their own for particularly for single family or smaller residential building types, whether they're single family detached or they're 2 units put together or 3 units put together. And then they start to jump up in scale. So you might have small apartment buildings or condominium buildings that can fit in to fairly typical lot patterns within a neighborhood or on a corner, or where the street turns to be a bigger, more active street. So we tend to go from, it's like mama bear, baby bear, papa bear kinds of sizes, which things that nest within different contexts in different ways. So they're small and medium in the residential typology. So for instance, if you're doing really urban townhouses, and there are a lot of them and they're all attached, that would jump up into a medium category. Small tends to be more related to the single family house, so it sort of grows from there. Small urban buildings can be mixed use. They might have a little shop or an office on the ground floor. And it could be all offices, it could be all commercial. The idea is that it's really the building type that we're focused on, the size and how it can fit in to existing block patterns. And then it steps up from medium to urban, medium urban buildings to large urban buildings. And that's both, we think, both a footprint element in that. How big is it on the ground? You know, how long are the facades? Do they take up a whole block? Is it, you know, something that fits into a block? And so we'll parse these by scale, so that when we talk about where are large urban buildings appropriate, regardless of the use, but just the mass and the scale of it, it's not everywhere, right? It's more at home in some precincts than in others. And so rather than just being open-ended about uses or about building height, what we're finding as we go through these exercises, this is such a fine-grained network of colliding street grids and odd sites here and there, that it's better, we think, and more predictable to begin to think about the building typology and where they really fit versus all the time just size. So there are other factors in this, and this is just sort of demonstrating the difference in scale. And a lot of what happens in your C4 and in the downtown design guidelines starts to address this, but we don't have anything really like this for neighborhoods so much. You know, when you get to that scale where we're out of the downtown, like what do different building sizes need to do to speak to really different scales across the street or adjacent to them? So you can see in this one, this is just demonstrating that if you've got a small apartment building or an apartment building adjacent to what might be a much finer grained single family neighborhood, we find that by repeating those elements and beginning to bring a building that's a larger building into scale with what's around it is a really important massing technique. And you use it a bit here. We've gotten very specific about this kind of thing on addresses like South Main Street in Augusta, where it is a stated goal to keep new development reflecting the context of legacy development that was much smaller in scale. So we'll see a little bit of that here as well. But this is a menu that we're building. These are just sort of demonstration about how we're thinking about it, and then we'll have more meat on the bones for, you know, actually what step backs mean, how deep might they be, and what's the adjacency equation look like next to existing buildings. So we were working from this portrait of existing conditions, and we've gotten feedback from our meetings with you about, reading this map so we know what's in place now, what's approved, and then what are possibilities, because we're not the developers, but as we anticipate vacant lots that we can see now, how should we think about those frontages and those adjacencies as the West End continues to develop? So this is a kind of a portrait, and it's probably not labeled correctly because not everything is in the ground. You have a lot of legacy projects that were approved by Planning Commission or by council and have not been constructed yet. So we'll tinker with this, change the coloring a little bit. So when you look at it, you can say, oh, okay, here's one that's approved, but it's not built yet. But we tend to like to treat them, if they've gone through an approval process, treat them as existing conditions so that at least we acknowledge that things always change for certain over time, but it's kind of the best picture we have of how the West End is growing. And then in the master plan recommendations, we have typically been looking at where we know there are vacancies. Some of them have proposals, some of them don't. So for instance, in the West End, and particularly in the Cottage precinct that we've been talking, one of the precincts we've been talking about, the Planning Commission just approved an infill plan in that neighborhood, and we've revised this map to show what's going through the process now and how that might affect the patterns that we're dealing with all around us. So you'll see in that map, as we look at Academy on this sort of western end of it, that's been updated to reflect that actually as a condition that we'll be responding to moving forward. So these are living documents. Things come in at all different times. There are buildings that haven't been built yet, and they may change over time, but this is meant to begin to set the vision future forward as we go through new processes as well, and begin to think about the vision that was articulated here and how best to make new development work with those criteria. So it combines some things there. The pink dots you see there were areas that had been identified through this process of areas of street improvements, crossing, safety, pedestrian crossing safety issues. And when you look at the building patterns that you see here, a lot of those are anticipated building patterns that the plan pushes this neighborhood towards. So for instance, on Pendleton Street, rather than treating it as an older commercial corridor that was highway oriented, we need new building patterns as these sites redevelop, should create great street frontage and start making a great street for the neighborhoods that surround it. So that would be a change in both development criteria and policy going forward. And it needs, if we're going to do that, then it needs to be very clear and hardwired in to the toolkit as it evolves. The other element that we focused on a bit here, coming out of your comments really over the course of the last couple of months, was the improvement in connectivity and particularly the pedestrian experience. So big moves like looking, getting out a little bit and looking at what, for instance, let's just take Pendleton, because that's been a source of a lot of comments, what Pendleton is really connecting and what it continued to connect in the future, from the hospital property to West End Village to Vardry and Augusta and the stadium. Those nodes we think are pretty important. And we think as sites redevelop along the Pendleton corridor, there could also be a kind of constellation of new little centers along there, because some sites are quite big. Others may just develop incrementally as the fabric in between. So Pendleton here on the connectivity side, in the big picture, the desire was to add much better bike connectivity and a much better pedestrian experience along that street. How could we do that? Slow traffic down as it comes through the neighborhood here. So that's a big piece of it. You see the little dots for making sure you can cross at these intersections, and then they may need some tinkering to make the geometries work and make the intersections better. On trail connectivity, we talked about the opportunity to take a look at Academy and the existing sidewalk that's running along Academy, and the notion that we might be able to expand that to be a much more gracious and safer multi-use path that runs at a minimum from Markley all the way to the Swamp Rabbit Trail, flanking the Academy corridor. So how can we get better bike and pedestrian experience along that very busy road? Can we do that along that edge? And it looks like there's good potential for it, but that's going to be an initiative that we're going to need champions for, and it is a kind of everybody in to begin to push these kinds of connections forward as the West End develops. Another little one, which we've been calling, you'll see this again in the Loft precinct, the Stadium Walk, the opportunity in where the Greenville Transit site is today as that redevelops. Can we flank the railroad tracks with a new pedestrian connection that gets you from Main Street and that corner with the railroad tracks to Augusta Street and the corner at Field Street, where all of that activity is taking place on Jackson Way. So we think those two pieces could be really terrific for a neighborhood scale connection, getting you connected up really across the grain, if you will. So that connectivity idea of, can we just change the paradigm by thinking about some particularly multimodal connectivity like bike and pedestrian traffic in a different way than we're thinking about it today. So are there opportunities for that? So as we look at this Academy Street frontage, as it courses on the north side of the West End neighborhoods, I think there's a pretty good opportunity for that, and begin to think about that whole edge differently now than you do today. So we started when we had our last meeting of just starting to map out what seemed like a reasonable pattern and edges for these different precincts. And we included in this original one the notion that while Sterling neighborhood is not part of this planning effort, they're really going to be affected by the changes that are being presented here. So I think, as we think about what's happening on Arlington Street, for instance, one street over from, or Arlington Avenue, one street over from Pendleton, that's very much tied to that Pendleton future. So there'll need to be some socialization of those ideas. And then how these overlap and interact, we've been talking about. We turn this little perspective into, for these precincts, each of these has a very specific idea behind them, into the first kind of draft of what would look like a regulating plan. So when you look at each of these, the setbacks along each street, the adjacencies across streets, where one character might blend into the next, where there might be a kind of seam between them, or an overlap. So for instance, South Main Street is a precinct, but it overlaps like 3 other precincts, right? So, and it gets a kind of priority because of its of its own character, maybe being somewhat different than what's behind it, for the way we talk about regulating buildings and thinking about scale and character. Same with the Augusta precinct. It has frontage that's very particular to that edge of the district and is quite different than what's happening around it. So we'll run through this a little bit about how we could see the system working and talk about opportunities with that. When we talked last time about the river precinct, knowing that studies are happening all the time, but now thinking about what might happen along the riverfront and what is currently parking, conference center uses and that sort of thing. But our focus here was over the long haul as this little precinct builds out. The idea for us is that the most important thing is that we have great streets, great street frontage, active streets. When you can walk around the block and it's whole, and it's full of active uses and making great public space throughout, that's when, you know, a neighborhood and a little precinct gels. So there are some important streets. We thought that River, as it comes through, connects to Richardson going across into downtown, is one of those citywide gateways that comes into this precinct. So the opportunity to get building frontage over time as these blocks develop would be a priority on River Street. The same for Falls Park Drive. As you come in off of Academy right now, it's a lot of parking lots there. If those ever redevelop, then with buildings, it would be important to claim that gateway and that sort of crossing with River Street as an important face of the neighborhood, and to complete those street frontages so that we get a place that gets connected up. So when we talked about this last time, this is a compilation of the comments that add on to what you had already told us in the very first meeting. So this notion of preserving existing character and scale was important. There was a sense too that while the river gets a lot of attention in this precinct, that continuing the pattern that has happened to date, where you get these great little public spaces and tucked in plazas, that should continue through that precinct. So we continue to add additional amenities like that for the West End. Folks were not happy with the notion that you can turn a block and you run into a sea of surface parking lots, that it really is creates a disconnect in the way the district lives and feels. So keeping parking away from street frontage is another way of saying putting buildings or public spaces as that street frontage, and let's keep parking as a secondary use as much out of the public realm as we can. And then extend these pedestrian connections wherever we can do that was an important element from the response for this group. So we proposed these urban design recommendations last time that we were together, and this notion of continuing the river precinct is probably the most absorbs the most density and the biggest buildings, if you will, with all the hospitality uses and the frontage on the river, the larger mixed use buildings. That seems appropriate as an extension of downtown across the river. So that feels right. Keep doing that. Where we can integrate in additional public parking facilities that serve the whole precinct, not just the riverfront, is pretty important in the West End as the stadium continues we continue to look for parking opportunities for that and to support that. The more the merrier here that we can rely on as this area grows. And then the thought about Academy Street, knowing that is one of the potential connections as it drops down to the river and connect to the trail, to make sure we explore that in the redevelopment opportunities. Don't leave that on the table. And South Main Street came in here when we talked about the overlay of precincts, because it is part of the river precinct right there as you cross the bridge on the park. But that South Main Street has this memorable sort of character to it, and don't want to lose that, so that redevelops in a way where you begin to lose that connection to the legacy of South Main. And then again, building public plazas into the precinct where possible is pretty important. So if we take this little, let me blow this up a little bit so you can see it. This idea of a regulating plan and building types, these sort of three things go together. You've got a regulating plan that identifies the block number, and you can see the frontages, the street frontages that flank each of these blocks. So building types and setbacks and building heights in particular, we haven't done a height map yet, but we're just sort of trying to work through what makes sense within these blocks. Will start to get codified. So in the little matrix here, block numbers are on the left. We talk about maximum height in stories within each of those blocks. We look at setbacks on all the surrounding streets. We talk about what are the appropriate building types for this district here, or this precinct here, and begin to put in our thoughts about those. And then general land use, not to get really specific, but for instance, this is probably the most mixed use precinct in a way. The Loft precinct is pretty close behind, but it's almost all of the general land uses we think would be appropriate in here. Everything from restaurant to civic or institutional uses to hotels, of course, to office, commercial, mixed use, residential. So it's got a pretty big breadth in the river precinct. And with each of these buildings identified on the page at the bottom, some of those are placeholders now, but those will be key to a whole section within the small area plan that talks about building form, building massing, footprint size, response to adjacent building types within the neighborhood, so that we get a finer grain picture of what we're trying to do in these neighborhoods, particularly when they cross over between different street addresses, or turn the corner from Academy to River Street, for instance, or to Falls Park Drive. So that's the river precinct as the first kind of example. The South Main and Augusta precincts, these are the sort of twins that have really similar scale and character to them, and define portals into the West End. So in this one, as it surrounds and comes, these sort of embrace the stadium, which we were talking about today. I thought there was a really lovely sentiment of this great public space that you've created here is the kind of front porch, the big front porch for the whole area. And I love that, because these kind of amenities and assets are often where communities come together for many, many different kinds of events. And so the fact that these two little precincts sort of create the addresses, many of the addresses there, I think we're lucky there, because I think it creates kind of rich context. And you can see the little green arrow and the two green dots. And this shows up in a couple of diagrams, but that was the Stadium Walk and the proposal for two new neighborhood parks within the West End as part of the redevelopment that can occur there. So your feedback to us was consistent after we looked at this the last time. It was preserve this building scale, and let's try to get, there was overwhelming sentiment for, like, what happened to the art scene here? You know, we have the West End Village. It's wonderful, it's funky, but when you get over here, the connectedness to that, or the idea of that, is this sort of fundamental component and personality of the West End. Are we losing it? can't we look at these precincts, which are these collection of both funky historic buildings, legacy buildings, smaller scale stuff, as having more art-centric uses, and beginning to treat buildings, you know, a little bit as public art as well. Open space, this has come up in a lot of discussions. We need more finer grain, neighborhood scale public spaces that people can use deeper into the West End neighborhoods. And then that same kind of rallying cry to enhance the pedestrian connections along here. And a lot of that was about eliminating the vacant parcels and parking lots in between, because people sort of come across South Main, even Augusta, you know, at the Greenville Transit site, and you quit walking. You know, that last active use. The Gather has pulled folks further south on Augusta since that opened. Certainly the Children's Theater is doing that, and with what's happening at Jackson Way and the District 365, that'll continue to become a draw for folks on Augusta as well. So again, the recommendations, let's build on that character. Let's figure out how we can get more generous pedestrian space and public space along Augusta. That stuff gets pretty tight in places, tiny sidewalks, if you will, and a lot of vacancies right now. The idea that you would regulate buildings so that there's a maximum 3-story height along the frontages here, that's pretty classic South Main Street. We think it is a good module, and if you want to do bigger buildings, they're stepped back from the street front and become background pieces of that. We'll look at that in a minute. And then this idea of integrating public art into the signage, into the building design. So this really has a local Greenville flavor. It's not a sort of franchise location that could be anywhere. And we can express that in many ways, but both public space, building design, building signage, landscape, all of that is part of that. So we took this little photograph on South Main as we're driving towards the stadium at O'Neill, where O'Neill Street crosses. And you can see on the right-hand side where right beside the tree is an empty lot that one of these days will be built on. And then there's a little small 1-story building. Then there's another empty lot, new development behind it, and then an empty lot beside that as you get to the cigar warehouse. So there's a lot of infill opportunity here when you just abstract it and you look at these sites. And some of them have narrow frontages, but they go deep all the way to Rhett Street. So the buildings could actually, in the parking, has a minimum of 2 different addresses. There's the Rhett Street frontage, and then there's the South Main frontage. So we look at this idea of like, what are we saying to the development and the design community as folks come in and propose new buildings here. So if we look back at what had been developed over time, there's one sort of 4-story building. We're suggesting that at the street front, maximum 3. And then if you're doing 4 or more, you're stepping back prescribed amount before you get into taller building masses. And when you look at what that could create for us, there are 2 things at play here. One is we're just crossing in on South Main to what we identified as the Loft Precinct, formerly known as the Warehouse District way back when. And those buildings, the idea is that those buildings would begin to reflect that location. That as we get closer to the stadium, so we get closer to the legacy warehouses, the architecture recognizes that and becomes part of that place. It may be different in the River Precinct, where it's more eclectic. It's got more urban things happening, but as we get deeper into the West End, that flavor could change. So these smaller buildings could also take on that personality of more of simpler and a more industrial era kind of architecture while having completely new uses. So that's That's the way that the building type regulations can work. And so it goes into each site. If we're looking back the other way, and we looked at this last time, I think there's an empty site now. It has temporary surface parking there for folks right by the tracks, right by the stadium. Cigar warehouse is across the street on our left. It would be the same rules where, yeah, the frontage along South Main is going to be the scale of 1 to 3 stories. And then if it's in part of a bigger building, that steps back away from the street. So what you feel as a pedestrian and see as a pedestrian when you're on the street frontage is that scale. And it works really well. The other thing that this is showing in the drawing, as you notice, it's a pretty broad plaza out in front of this little shop. That's hardwired into the code. This is where one of the new quote unquote neighborhood parks would be. So it expands the public realm. You still get plenty of room for terrace seating, outdoor dining, all that kind of stuff that might want to happen adjacent to the stadium. And where you see people walking in the foreground in that lower right-hand corner, they're headed down the greenway, the stadium walk path adjacent to the railroad tracks. So now we've got another pedestrian connection that gets us through this from Main Street to Augusta Street to Field Street, which becomes the new sort of festival street location and destination. So this is kind of what as we sort of think about those rules for massing, this is what it's intended to generate at the street level. If we go to that other corner on Augusta and Field Street, if you walk down Field Street now, you've got the appetizing view of a dumpster and then the service area for what is the transit site. So as this changes and becomes part of what we have lovingly called the Augusta Triangle, because you can never tell what's in the middle, it's always around the edges, this would become the other end of that space, which is a new public park. And this connects to the stadium's planning and their festivities and becomes part of that big front porch idea, where the stadium is the sort of center of the universe on event days. And even on non-event days, can we add to this in a way that if you're a resident here, you got kids, you're meeting a friend, the park and the little shops on Augusta, which are doing the same thing, it's the 1-story and 2-story elements that come out to the street. And then we expand the setback from Augusta so that we have a much broader pedestrian zone along that street and spaces for folks to spill out. So it pulls back a little bit behind where the gather is so that the gather can still, it has great synergy with that use and tries to stay in scale at that street level. So same sort of methodology. We go through, label each block, think about those setbacks, maximum height, a number of stories for that, and the range of uses and building typologies that could be in the South Main precinct. Same thing for the Augusta precinct. In Augusta, just since this goes block by block, and sometimes a little bit smaller where the blocks are divided. On the north side of Augusta is where we can get this expanded pedestrian zone. The south side is a little bit locked in by existing building patterns, so you can't really do that continuously, but on the north, really control it from South Main Street. There's some existing buildings on that end where it hits South Main Street, but as you get to Jackson Way and the stadium, that deeper setback and the park spaces are very much a part of that pattern. So those frontages, we think contribute heavily to this idea of the loft precinct, of which the stadium is the sort of center for that. And I was impressed the first time walking through here. As you walk by those great old buildings that have been reused and retrofitted for offices and restaurants and event spaces and all of that, along Rhett Street, South Main. Then this idea of the stadium and the stadium precinct as being the sort of full expression of this legacy warehouse district makes, to me, perfect sense. And the fact that you can rebuild a kind of ethic and sense of place in neighborhoods that are developing all over. But you've got to tell people, you know, you can't hide. That's not something that, you know, oh, it'd be a nice to have. It's like, you know, we like this. This is how we see ourselves. We like building on that character. And I think the buildings that are going in just south of Field Street, adjacent to Augusta and adjacent to Vardry, that architecture does that. It's evocative of that era and that type of building. So, you know, looking at this fresh, as we think about what's happening to the improvements along the southern part of the stadium and along Field Street, the new mixed-use building that's fronting the stadium on that side, the little proposal we had for the stadium greenway going up that eastern side really makes almost a continuous public space experience in this part of the West End, which we have on the streets. We just, right now, we don't have any other way to connect those. So this involves two new little public neighborhood parks and plazas at the corners and a new kind of greenway connection. So how do you do that? You know, one thing that we want to get set in this is that in order to do that, we really need setback from the railroad right away. And the building, where the building faces can be located, thinking about the height and the character of that space, how that might work. And again, thinking about the building patterns within the Augusta triangle and the relationship to the surrounding building stock. So you told us, again, consider this appropriate scale along the pedestrian edges. Let's look at the character here, preserve and add green space where you can, and let's improve the way pedestrians can negotiate all these connections. So when I look at the architecture that's being built now and look at some of the work that has already been built along this corridor, you know, it's really exciting because you can see that, you know, some buildings really took that to heart and responded to it. Others, not so much. So we think that this is something that you may want to consider moving front and center as part of the redevelopment ethic here. So again, preserve and maintain that South Main Street character, integrate more public spaces, provide the expanded pedestrian connections here, and break down these larger building forms into more distinct, smaller, and responsive forms. And let's start responding. Whatever we do new, let's consider the DNA of this industrial legacy along the tracks and build that into our thinking about character. So when you're in the air and we're looking over the stadium north, you see South Main and Augusta Street, this idea of the loft precinct kind of finding a complete form with the stadium and what's happening there with South Main and Augusta frontage going from smaller scale to the bigger buildings maybe enmeshed in the middle of the Augusta Triangle building. And you see the park space at the corner down here of Augusta and Field Street. We talked about the little plaza at the north end, but a much more generous kind of greenway connection between the south and the north. So how would that feel? How do you do that? How do you connect it to interior park spaces that might be within that block and have a different address through the West End than we have now, linking it back to the stadium and back to South Main. So the loft precinct is largely between O'Neill Street and the stadium. So if Markley is the westernmost boundary of that in terms of character and scale, then going through again each of these blocks and block frontages and thinking about setbacks a bit more. One of the things that we're suggesting in many of these matrices is that as you get into some of these bigger buildings within these small precincts, this was never started out as a downtown, so it didn't have the really broad streets or broad sidewalks. That there is oftentimes when you're walking down it, it feels like we're getting too squeezed. The buildings are bigger, sidewalks are still tiny. If it's all residential, you could use more space, making transition between the private realm of a condominium or an apartment or working space and the public edge of the street. So we've been suggesting a bit deeper setbacks than the zero setback that for a lot of these blocks is the is the default, and then you move from there. That it might be more appropriate for this kind of district to have a bit more landscape and a bit more breathing room, a bit more transition between the tinier sidewalks and tinier streets and that private space. So that's the loft precinct. The cottage precinct, we updated that diagram to sort of, we always had a new street going through the middle, which is still part of the proposal there, and then the infill along Academy, which is the bigger a bigger multifamily, a little bit of mixed use on the ground floor facing Academy, and then the infill patterns of attached housing and smaller stacked housing, townhouses and apartments above. So that you can sort of see what that as that fills in that block in between Ware and Calhoun, and proposed new frontage along Perry, thinking about, again, the building typologies for that, how that really becomes part of the character and image for the cottage precinct and stays in scale. As you look at the eastern part of this precinct, they're tiny blocks, very narrow blocks, and the houses get a bit smaller there. And thinking about how that evolves over time, we're still at that very same notion that it does fill in with like buildings that are sympathetic in character and have a cadence that holds together a little cottage precinct like this, versus replacing everything with larger scale buildings that completely obscure what it was in the past and how it's growing today. So this provides a little bit of a foil in a way, or a differentiation to what else is happening beside us in the loft precinct or in the Pendleton precinct. So as much as you can, small scale development to match existing scale and character. Let's extend street lighting and improve the sidewalks and the connectivity. Also at major intersections where people are trying to cross, let's work over the next few years to get those improvements identified and implemented. And then how can we bring park space into redevelopment opportunities within the neighborhood? So those were really right in line with the notion of urban design recommendations here. Let's stay within the scale and character and make sure that we're backstopping these patterns and creating whole places. And when we do transition between different building types, like when it becomes a bigger multifamily or mixed use building adjacent to these, let's really work on the transitions that happen between those. We've got commercial buildings on one side on Pendleton. There's all kinds of things that happen in the back of those buildings, like trash pickup and lighting and privacy screening. Let's get very specific about those as this moves forward and begin to nail that down as well. So we looked at one, and this is why we think that's why we like small area plans, where we can imagine a future scenario and get both the master plan and the toolkit set up to be able to accomplish these things as properties come online. So we looked at, we talked about it's a state-owned office building that is still active. I think I incorrectly identified it as a building that had already been vacated. It had been vacated because of COVID more than anything. But as you look at it, you understand that the way the city's changing and the way the West End is changing, this is likely a candidate, and it's a full block. And it's one of those pesky ones, right? Because it's got frontage on Pendleton, which is really a different address, and it's got frontage on Perry, where we're trying to hold scale and character and find, some new amenity space, park space for the whole area. So those are the kind of things we can set a vision for and begin to wire it in, hardwire it into the criteria for redevelopment in blocks like this. So it's helpful for us as a toolkit. But this is interesting. Like if you wanted a small grocery store on this block and it was available, you could probably do that fronting Pendleton without too much trouble. If it is going to be a mixed use, commercial, mix of residential or offices above that, you could do that in a way that has the higher density components in that half block facing Pendleton and transition to something that is residential in character and scale wise works with the whole cottage precinct. So we did a little sketch of what that could feel like. When you look at it today in the upper right hand corner, it's this grassy low-lying area along Perry Avenue. It goes up the hill to the office building. You kind of keep that same relationship in the redraw, and instead of putting new residential right up on the street, the requirements for open space here for this block as a redevelopment would be met in creating a little linear park along the block face, so that new housing would sit across the park on one side, and the new housing that would come up on the north side of Perry Avenue would also potentially have a great little park address there. So that's, that was one idea for combining those two needs in a redevelopment opportunity. That would probably be within our lifetimes here, given the rate you guys are developing. And so we looked at this the cottage precinct, as we're calling it, in finer grain detail. We had gotten back some comments as well, which I think were really helpful to us. This requires a little more nuance in breaking down blocks into finer grain components, where right now you may have development that's really going to be oriented to Academy versus to an interior street where it's facing single family residential. You're always having to deal with adjacencies, but understanding that the uses may be different closer to Academy, as they have been in the redevelopment scenario up to this date, but making sure that those parcels that front Academy, if you will, are part of this. We had sort of left them out largely before, where there were existing uses that were different than what's happening behind it. But as we move forward, you never know when those things are going to redevelop. So let's set the criteria for them now. So it gets a bit more fine grained what building types are allowed where. And you can see just by the chart, kind of when you look at the middle row of building types, we're largely all on the residential side here, and in the smaller scale residential buildings or small urban building types, except when you might get adjacent to Academy where it really warrants perhaps a larger building than single family houses or attached housing. So this is something to take a look at as well when you're going through the proposals here for each of these precincts. In the Pendleton precinct, we identified particularly where there were crossing challenges coming from the West End neighborhoods, both west and east, but a lot of this from the east side. that need to be dealt with. And so we've been talking with the transportation staff and the planning staff about their thoughts about these and about how we might begin to think about physical improvements to remedy some of these issues. So that'll be a menu that continues long after this plan. Our job is to identify it as a priority and make sure that we've got it on the agenda as the West End continues to develop over the years beyond this plan. The other big recommendation here was that as buildings begin to and sites redevelop, is to begin to pull the buildings up to the street. Let's start making a real street here that responds to both the character area-wide, the idea of uses that might be along here, and the change in access and traffic circulation, so that this becomes a safer and really a much more pleasant street for businesses as well as the neighborhood. So this little diagram sort of shows ideas about that in the dark purple, where we could see redevelopment happening. What you told us after the last time is that, yes, this is really not such a great experience today for pedestrian. Lord help you if you're on a bike, because you're kind of in there with traffic, but in casual use on bike or more inclusive kind of system is in need here. How do we make this a special street? And can we incorporate it as a complete street? Can we think about it more in those terms? And then this idea of let's slow traffic down. Do we really need 4 lanes coming barreling here when you know, at the end of Augusta or on the other side of Academy, it narrows back into 2 lanes. So we've started at this and have begun working with both the state and the city team to look at the conversion from 4 lanes to 2 lanes with on-street parking. And it may be on both sides, maybe on one side. How do you add bike infrastructure? There were a couple of alternatives, and I'm sure there are many permutations of that, but let's get started with what seems to work the best in the overall system. And then we thought that this is an area that, even though it's a continuous corridor through the West End, you really need to look at the existing patterns by block, just like we're doing everywhere else, and think about how setbacks and building types and building heights can work all the way along here. So that is going to be an important part. Lighting and landscape improvements, for sure. It's tough when we've got power lines that are running in the adjacent to the streets, and sometimes, you know, with a lot of development, the power company and the city get together and you can accomplish that. It's just, as we know, it's notoriously expensive to do and difficult. So thinking about that with power poles and without at sometime in the future, I think are important to think about landscape. How do we do that here in a way that's effective? And this, within each block, realizing that transition zones between commercial uses and as they back up to residential uses, we need to be having that as part of the redevelopment criteria for the base condition here. We do have to implement, in talking to the staff, one of the keys to this is starting to eliminate all these random curb cuts that are along here that let you make any kind of turn, any kind of move along the street, so that people are starting to use side streets to get into parking that is reorganized as sites incrementally redevelop, so that you get connected parking lots and not everybody segregating that. And so you need sort of cross easements, and that's got to be a front and center kind of criteria for redevelopment. So we know that you were successful, and the city was successful, even though this is a state-owned road, by redeveloping in exactly this way at the other end of Pendleton at the West End Village. So we were excited about that, and we said, let's just bring that show south all the way to Vardry and see what we can do here if that's a possibility. So we started with this diagram showing just the 4 lanes and the parking lots that line it. And then we looked at 3 options here, just so we could begin testing them to see what works better, what could work here. How does the state feel about this kind of infrastructure within the state right away, and begin to push this forward as a major redevelopment initiative along Pendleton. And so we just took a little view looking north on Pendleton on the right-hand side where you see the brown building imagines that the state office parcel, that's right where this is taken, has been redeveloped. You see the cycle lane with a sort of green color and this one on the western side. And then you see in this block in the foreground, really deep setbacks to those buildings. Well, this is a block that happens to have some of those historic houses that have 50-foot deep, 40-foot deep lawns in front of them. And this may be one of those blocks where we really want to retain that kind of sense of place and that kind of building setback along there. And that could be hardwired into the regulating plan for those blocks. So each block is a little bit different. You've got some really wacky patterns here, which go perpendicular to the street and have put in private parking lots and which function as little streets. And the idea is that over time, when you have the opportunity to redevelop those properties, we change that pattern, right, and get back to maybe pedestrian space or park space, but getting the access ways into a much more usable and functional pattern. So that gives you, it's a lot. Sorry to dump that all on you all at once, but again, we'll put this up on the website. We'll have the idea wall there that many of you have already used to give us feedback on what's missing or things you liked, things you thought that could be stronger, things you thought that could be different. And as we continue to work through this as an idea before we get into doing any kind of presentations to the planning commissions, we'll continue to have this dialogue as this small area plan as an idea evolves a bit more. So Austin, I'm good for opening up to Q&A or responses to any comments.
Yes, Rob. In just a moment, I'm going to open up all attendees, unmute you all. At that time, if you could please state your name if you'd like to speak for up to 3 minutes. I'll then write down your name and we'll go to each of you one at a time. So if you would like to speak, you are all unmuted. Just state your name and we will proceed from there. This is to anyone in our attendee list. You are unmuted if you'd like to state your name to speak for 3 minutes.
Hi, this is Steve Lammert.
I was Steve.
Curious about whether I noticed yes.
Would you be able to hold on for just a minute, just so we can get everyone's name, and then we'll come back to you?
Yeah, you bet. Thank you.
Anyone else wishing to speak? Please provide your name. If there's anyone else in our attendee list wishing to speak, please provide your name and we will get back to you in just a second. Going to go ahead and mute everyone again. And Steve, hold on for just a second. I'll get to you in just a second. Steve, you are now unmuted. If you could provide your name and address, and you have up to 3 minutes.
Yep, Steve Lammert. I'm at 318 Anderson Street, just off the West End. I'm actually a native of Pittsburgh, so I'm pleased to see Urban Design Associates involved in this project. and have enjoyed some of the work they've done in my old hometown.
Thanks.
Rob, I noticed that you did highlight at several points the sidewalk that's been put in between Field Street and South Main along the railroad tracks.
Mm-hmm.
And I keep hoping that that can be extended, because that railroad track, boy, it just goes where you want to go. It goes along Markley, and it loops around down toward Unity Park, and it goes past the high school. And I just wish that we could get more of that, you know, a trail alongside that single track. I don't expect that track will be abandoned for some years, but it certainly doesn't get heavy use. And I just wonder if you've looked at all about how that path could be longer.
Oh, Steve, yes. Yeah, it was, you know, since you're a Pittsburgher, you know what's happened here. It's the same deal, right? I think as we looked at it, we said, you know, the best of all worlds is exactly what you're talking about, where, you know, we've got a conversion from a spur track into a greenway trail that becomes part of your network. But what we thought is that if we can demonstrate really that first leg there, where that becomes part of a public space that's running alongside the track. What I've noticed in the West End, I don't know if I'm just naughty like everybody else, but I went there in the evening just to see what was happening along the tracks there. And it's astonishing how many people are using the edge of the tracks to get to Markley and some of the new uses that are there. And then you look at the Markley Street behind it on the east side facing the tracks, and you've got these sort of loading docks that are up high on the west side, which like perfect overlooks, right, to a rail line and a kind of entertainment piece. But I think there is, you know, it's skinny as it gets through the district. You'd love in some ways to be able to get all the way to Academy along the edge of the railroad. And while there are some buildings and some parking lots on the east side, who knows, it may be possible. But I think getting the party started, you know, without relying on the rail, but to be able to demonstrate how powerful that could be going through there, couldn't agree with you more. You know, it is important for the city over time to be able to take advantage of these abandoned, you know, when these lines get abandoned, and get that conversation started with the rail lines, because I think what and this is just me anticipating, when as development continues to occur in the West End, the laissez-faire attitude about rail crossings now will probably go away, right? Because it becomes too much of a big deal about when trains come through, and, you know, if you're having a ball game and all that good stuff. But yeah, I think as a long-term vision, absolutely. If we can start sneaking in connections adjacent to it where we can, it all the better, so that whole space, when it does evolve, becomes a much bigger park than just a you know, a little greenway along the line of the tracks. Couldn't agree with you more, Steve.
All right, I'm gonna open it up one more time. If you're on our attendee list and you wish to speak, please state your name and we will write your name down.
There's just 4 wings in here.
Would anyone like to speak for 3 minutes? You have been unmuted.
This is Kathy Stevens.
Thank you. Anyone else wishing to speak? Please state your name.
Kathy Stevens.
I have you, Kathy.
Okay, do you need my address or no?
Just a second, and we'll see if anyone else wishes to speak, and then we'll come back to you after I mute everyone else.
Christy Leonard.
Sorry, what was your name again?
Christy Leonard, Leonard.
Anyone else wishing to speak, please state your name. All right.
$4,400.
We go to Kathy first. Kathy, you are unmuted. Oh, excuse me. We have two Kathys on the line. Just a second. Go ahead, Kathy.
It's Kathy Stevens. I'm at 121 Red Street, but my question is really about the cottage area and how does the mosaic development that has been discussed in the West End Neighborhood Association, how does that relate to what your plans are in the cottage area?
So Kathy, this is Jay Graham. I'm the Planning and Development Services Director. I might be able to help out with this question. The Mosaic development is a project that's already in process. They made an application back in 2020 in the fall, either September or October. And so they are on a vested train, if you will, that project is, for all intents and purposes, considered to be part of the fabric, pending whether it gets approved or not. But for this study, we had to decide how are we going to treat that project. And so Rob and his team kind of integrated it and showed it in the drawings in the cottage district, similar to the multifamily project that's just across the street that's already there. And that's only because it's pending and because this project is ongoing. This study can't really impact that project without voluntary compliance from the applicant for legal reasons. You know, the applicant started this process long before this study even began. And so that's why this study can't really address that particular project. Does that help answer that question, Kathy?
Yeah. So in other words, even if it doesn't fit into the neighborhood as suggested in the small area plan, that's for the future and not for now.
Yes, ma'am. And that's this small area plan is looking at what is and how can we, you know, form the future. And so that particular project, if it doesn't get approved, then that would be a point to modify and say, well, what could happen in that area? But if it does get approved, then it will move forward as it is approved.
Okay, thank you.
I think
Great. Excellent question. Thank you, Kathy, for asking that.
I think too, as we, we think about the small area plan, the criteria about making sure that building types are fitting in, that frontages on like Perry Avenue, for instance, are working in sympathy with the neighborhood, both, sort of the porch culture and the scale and character of the houses. The relationship between big buildings and small buildings, all of that stuff has to be worked out yet. So those principles that we're talking about there's a lot of the cottage precinct remaining too, could be very consistent. And though, it's, we're on some items that may not have been exactly like what we were talking about, but the toolkit and the principles there, I think are very much intact. And there was, and there was a lot of conversation about some of that. So I think you've got, there's a lot of journey left in as that proposal becomes a real place and with real architecture and relationships. So there's a lot of good interaction to happen, I think, as that project moves forward.
Yeah, that's a good point, Rob. Kathy, I would add, this is a good discussion. So I would add to what Rob just said that one win is that the applicant did spend time with Rob and his team. And Rob and his team did have an impact on that project based on the original proposal that was made. So there has been some impact on this project. And to Rob's point, what so far has been proposed and what is being considered for approval is the concept. And I think to put it in better English, we still have the final development plan where they actually get into the details of how they are going to design their project. And that's where hopefully this can have even more influence on that project. So staff is certainly aware of this project. The neighborhood's aware of it as well as the applicant. And I think we all will work together to try and bring forward the best we can, given that it's already a vested project. So good question. Thank you.
Next up is Christy Leonard. Christy,
I'm
you're
at
now unmuted.
201 Perry Avenue.
Go ahead, Christy.
My question is primarily concerning Mosaic as well, which just feels, Rob, I applaud you for still calling our district the cottage district, because there's been a recent questionnaire or online post where they've changed it over to Perry, and we on Perry know we're not the only people in this cottage district. So I certainly hope that our district will remain inclusive rather than just honing in on the fact that Perry is one part of it. But I feel like what you're saying certainly doesn't match what we've been presented with from Mosaic. I mean, nothing that they presented even matches the zoning ordinances in our area. But it feels like it's already accepted that something from them is coming through. And I hear you saying it hasn't been approved, but I also hear it being sketched in on the drawings and being part of the expectation because it's a vested, application. And it's terrifying to me. But my biggest concern is the fact that one of the big pushes right now, one of the catchphrases is affordable housing. And I think Perry is already such a good example of that. We have, subsidized housing with single family homes with children that play in very large yards all of the time outside and laughing and giggling and enjoying their homes, who possibly, very likely, will be displaced and maybe given a space in an apartment with shared space with a lot of other people in a very densely populated development. And it doesn't at all fit what Rob is saying about our district, that we are single family homes, that we want to keep this character in this area, that we want to encourage that. I applaud the extra green spaces that are being considered, but Mosaic doesn't fit any of that. And their big words are, we hear that you like porches, which, yeah, I mean, I have a great porch. Y'all are welcome to come visit, but that's not our primary concern, is whether or not you put a porch on the front of your building. So I hope that you stay true to understanding that we really want the character of the cottage district to remain primarily single family homes, and that you are true in saying that the sizes matter, that these are very small single family spaces. And yes, you could moderately increase the scale, but that doesn't mean what Mosaic has presented at any of their, presentations thus far. So we're very concerned in our district, and I just wanted to make sure I was on record as saying so.
No, thank you so much. And we do hear you. And I think the takeaway for tonight is, if a new project like Mosaic came forward today, certainly this would have a huge impact on any future development. That existing project, we hear you loud and clear. The area is zoned RDV and RM2, and we are taking forward their proposal, but at the end of the day, it's up to the commission to review that and to review and decide whether or not they want to move forward with it, approve it because it meets the minimum standards of the ordinance, or they want to approve it with conditions, or they want to deny it. So we're not, staff isn't saying we're for it or against it, or we think it's good or we think it's bad. Our job is to bring it forward for that review and approval process. So we hear you. The only difficulty is in the framework of tonight is that process started back in 2020, and this process started roughly in March of this year. So this is excellent, and we're very glad to have Rob on board, and this is going to help frame the future. So thank you for your comments there.
That concludes our public comment speakers. Shannon, if you want to close us out, or if Rob had any further comments, we can get to that as well.
Yeah, let me just, before Shannon comes on, I think a couple of things. This has been, as we've been going through this for the last few months, we've had, I think, incredible participation by the neighborhood and by folks in the neighborhood. We're still making sausage here, as they say, before we, go into Planning Commission and further kind of validate some of the findings here. And I think it's really reflective in Greenville. You guys, and like a lot of cities, but particularly you guys, are developing very quickly. And it's a broader group coming in. So leading with vision so that we can reset tools is whenever you do it. You're always putting your foot into a stream, right? The water's flowing by, but you've got to begin to take a pulse of like what's happened to us, where are we going? And if we can all keep participating in this process and setting a really clear vision, I think it's going to pay dividends for generations to come. I'm really happy that the city's sort of gotten back into this mode, because we used to do this a lot, of giving more weight and more credence to what we do in the small area plan, so it can inform how those zoning districts get rewritten, right? How those adjacent relationships get better defined, so that we're not having to argue each one of those at every proposal that comes in. That new developers coming into the neighborhood know exactly what's expected of them in terms of vision. They see the vision, they understand those elements, and I think it'll be very, very powerful here as we move forward. So stay with us. We've got the summer to go here. We're scheduled right now in July to have a kind of first look at a draft of the small area plan with the Planning Commission. And so we'll be coming back to you with what we hear, from these sessions, and refine that a bit more, make sure we've got it formulated as well as we can, and that reflects the sentiment of those who live and work here. So thank you for this participation, and stick with us, because we're not at the finish line yet. We've got a little ways to go. So Shannon, I don't know if you take us out, but that's from us.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you everyone this evening for being here. Rob, I do think that we do have a workshop scheduled with the Design Review Board next Tuesday morning that I would like to just remind everybody on the call. And then I know we talked about trying to also do a fourth public meeting before the Planning Commission, that we're trying to work out a date where we maybe would try to do that one in person, since we've not had that opportunity up till this point. So I just wanted to encourage everyone on the call to keep a lookout for that on our calendar and our social media channels. And thanks to our communications team, who does a great job supporting us to get that word out. And with that, I don't have anything else to add, except for we're continuing to always want your feedback. As Rob said, this is a draft. This is still very much a work in progress. This is very much still something that we want to hear comments on. So please feel free to reach out to Rob or to Austin, our project manager from our planning team on this project, or even through Greenville Cares. They'll make sure we get the comments. We definitely want to hear from each and every one of you on the call this evening. Austin's email is arutherford@greenvillesc.gov. So I'm sure he's glad that I just did that. but it's, I haven't memorized Austin. But thank you to everyone, Rob, Jay, Austin, or anyone from our other team. And we've also got our members of our team on here that have been with us the whole time from our other departments. So anybody else has anything else to say, please do. Otherwise, we'll see you all soon.
Thanks, Shannon.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Good night, everybody. Have a good evening.